Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. That's the main man there, Greg. Always good to catch up with you. We're in the final week of the regular season, and we have some games with playoff implications on the line. But for the most part, everybody's got their playoff spot locked up. They're just still duking it out in the AFC North and the NFC South. And, the NFC North is going to be as good a game as we could have asked for
Yeah.
a regular season finale, Greg.
No, yeah, Lions Vikings, that's the Sunday nighter. That should be a good one. I mean, it's I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks they're no longer under the radar now, they're above the radar, but it seems like the Vikings were not really talked about much all season long until very, very recently when people kind of looked up and said, wait a second, they only have two losses.
Yeah, just casually rattling off 9 wins in a row.
Yeah,
What's
yeah,
there to
yeah.
pay attention to, Greg?
I know. I know. Um,
Well, given that is the case, and the Titans are vying for the number one overall draft pick at this point in time, I don't imagine we need to spend much time on their result against the Jacksonville Jaguars over the weekend. I would like to talk about the Bengals, Greg, if we could start there
sure. Absolutely.
today, because Joe Burrow is on the precipice of doing something that very, very few quarterbacks have ever accomplished, which is 5,000 passing yards and 45 touchdowns. He's 3 touchdown passes away from accomplishing that goal, and his team is barely breathing as far as their playoff hopes go. But they have a huge game against the Pittsburgh Steelers this weekend, who are also vying for the divisional lead at this point in time. On the Bengals side of things, what are you seeing from Burrow right now? Is he playing his best football of his career?
Well, it's funny that I think most people watching, and obviously not watching tape, but just watching him play on television, realize how well he's playing. I mean, you mentioned the precipice. He needs 3 touchdowns, which of course he's done for 8 consecutive games now, throwing
Mm.
3 touchdowns or more, in addition to throwing for 250 plus yards in those 8 games as well. I went back and I looked at my evaluation of Burrow coming out of LSU, which I believe was that the 2020 draft?
COVID draft, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and basically I loved him. The only thing he didn't have, and it's obviously not a big deal, was he didn't have a power arm. He's not Matthew Stafford or he's not Josh Allen or, you could even argue, he's not Sam Darnold just in terms of sheer arm strength. But everything else he has. And that's the way in which he plays. And you've seen him this year more and more make plays where he's moving around a bit. And he's not a creator in the sense that you think of the Josh Allens or the Mahomes or the Lamar Jackson, who's obviously a different level when it comes to that kind of movement. Jaden Daniels has sort of fallen into that category as well. But he just is so calm and composed when he moves, Buck. His eyes are always downfield. That's not an easy thing to do when you're moving and there's bodies around you and you could take a shot at any moment from maybe someone you can't quite see because you're moving and everything changes. But yet he never drops his eyes. And I
Yeah.
can tell you that so many quarterbacks drop their eyes. And then one other point that I think is not an X and O point, and I actually heard Troy Aikman talking about this on Monday night because Joe Buck asked him who his MVP was, and he actually said Joe Burrow. But what he essentially spoke about, and obviously you and I can't, we can't live this. Troy Aikman having, being a Hall of Fame quarterback can certainly understand it, but it really resonated with me. And he said that you have to understand how difficult it is to go into a game every single week, knowing that you have to put up 35 points just to compete, not necessarily win, just to compete.
Yeah.
And, that the burden of that every single week, that's, we can't understand that because, and I think that really says a lot about Burrow. It never seems to impact the manner in which he plays. He never seems hurried about anything he's doing.
Well, and he's gotten so used to being under duress at this point, Greg, that he makes
Yeah.
it seem second nature with the way that he's able to maneuver in the pocket that way. And certainly with what they run, uh, we have as an offense under Dan Pitcher, the former quarterbacks coach, now offensive coordinator after Brian Callahan comes here to Tennessee. I wonder how you kind of look at him within their scheme, because he seems to do so much just from the untrained eye, right? He seems to do so much unto himself. He's still playing on schedule. He's still
Yeah.
keeping that offense on time. But I wonder how you look at him within their system and make that evaluation based on what you studied and what you see them asking him to do.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think he's the kind of quarterback that can essentially do anything. So,
Yeah.
it's not a case of, well, you can only run certain things with Burrow. Um, you know, he plays with incredible. Well, let me say it this way. There have been people who said to me, "Oh, he's got great receivers. A lot of guys could, put up big numbers." The numbers are the numbers. I mean, but when you evaluate a quarterback, and I learned this very early on in my career from people smarter than I, you have to isolate the traits, attributes, and characteristics of the quarterback. That's how you evaluate a quarterback. Okay. And you can see those regardless of who the receivers are. Sure, might the numbers be a little better if you have better receivers? Yes, they might be. But when you evaluate a quarterback, you start with the most basic things. You start with his drop, his set. Does he play on time? Is there a sense of rhythm to him? Does he hit his back foot? Does the ball come out? What is he doing pre-snap to post-snap? Is he recognizing things pre-snap? Is he validating post-snap? Is he seeing things clearly? Is he throwing it to the right receiver at the right time with the right kind of throw? How does he handle bodies around him? Because not every time can you move. Sometimes the pocket squeezed and you still have to make a throw. So there's so many traits and attributes that go into evaluating a quarterback that have nothing to do with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Now, there's no question that and by the way, sometimes being aggressive with a quarterback, like Burrow is very aggressive throwing outside the numbers. I would bet that he would do that regardless of who the receivers are. Now, does he have more success because he's throwing to Chase and Higgins? Maybe. That's something that's an unknown because he's played with them pretty much his whole career. But um, you know, as I said, you have to evaluate the traits, and he's got really, really high level traits, and he's added this really comfortable movement. He's always been a good athlete, maybe a better athlete than he's been given credit for, because everybody looks at the other guys who, seem special in their movement. But, he's added that to his game this year. You see it more and more. He probably not like to be doing that, but he has to do it. But he just has really, really high level quarterback traits, and there's just a calmness to him. I remember, and you probably saw it too. What was the name of the Michael Jordan series on ESPN? Um,
Oh,
The
oh
Last
my
Dance,
God.
maybe?
The Last Dance, yes.
Yeah, yeah. I remember
Yeah, it's
watching it.
it's bailed us all out during the pandemic when there was no live sports to watch.
Correct, and that's probably when I watched it.
Yeah.
And I remember someone saying about Jordan that they'd never seen an athlete just be able to live in a given moment, regardless of what happened before, no sense of what might happen next, but just live in that moment the way Michael Jordan could. And again, I don't know what's in Burrow's head, but just watching Burrow both live and on tape, my sense is he's somewhat like that. It's just each play and each moment is just that's it right then. What happened before and what happens next, that's not even part of his thought process.
Yeah, no, it's one of the more interesting components of it because, of course, it's impossible for us externally to
We,
quantify.
yeah, we
But
don't
there's
know it
no
either,
disputing that this man is has this killer instinct that you can't wrap your
Right.
mind around, other than you see professional athletes who get in these certain kind of modes and the way that they carry themselves, the way that they execute, the way that they operate
I mean,
on a regular basis.
here's
And Joe
just
Burrow
to
is
show you.
indisputably one of them.
Here's what when he came out and I did my evaluation. And by the way, he's 6'3" and a half, 221. That's where his combine numbers. And that's a trait. 6'3" and a half is good size. We lose sight of that sometimes because so many quarterbacks now come in the league, Buck, as you know, that are 6'1", maybe 6'1" and a half, but 6'3" and a half. He's a big dude.
Yeah.
So this is the last thing I typed in my transition because, as you know, you've seen all my work. I do strengths, weaknesses, transition. I said Burrow consistently exhibited the needed traits to play consistently and effectively in the NFL: poise, vision, clarity, timing, pocket efficiency, precise ball placement, second reaction ability. He's a high-level prospect with a chance to be an outstanding NFL quarterback. That's what I typed. So that, I did that before he was drafted. So that
Yeah.
was based on watching his college tape. So, I'm not surprised by what I've seen from Joe Burrow at this level because you saw those traits in his college tape.
Yeah, not surprised, but just delighted to see it play out
Ah,
at the pro level. Absolutely, it's a treat, and I'm actively rooting for the Bengals this weekend. I'll be honest, I'd love to see Joe Burrow get into the playoffs and see if they can't make some noise. I'd hate to see them coming into town if they were a wild card team, even though their defense, in that Denver game, that defense definitely
no.
does not do them many favors throughout the course of this. Now, Pittsburgh's also not in a great spot, Greg. They've lost three straight. Their most recent game was a pretty, I don't want to call it outright non-competitive, but they weren't really keeping pace with the Chiefs, who seem to have started to, at least turned it on offensively. Not to, that's not a technical term, of course, but you understand what
No,
Kansas
of
City
course.
is
Yeah.
and how they manage the
Yeah.
situation. On the defensive side of the ball, though, Greg, for Pittsburgh, what are you seeing from them right now, and what kind of problems could they present Joe Burrow?
Well, they didn't present many when they played earlier this season.
Sure.
That was the high scoring game. That was probably Pittsburgh's last really good offensive game.
Yeah,
Um,
44-38.
yeah. And I think the Steelers in that game had over 500 yards of total offense, which, they probably haven't done that in two or three games combined recently, it seems,
Yeah.
Um, I think Pittsburgh defense, their defense to me starts with pressure and their line. Cam Hayward has had a phenomenal season. I mean, obviously TJ Watt's talked about and deservedly so. He's on his way to being a first ballot Hall of Famer. And they've got, Highsmith and Herbig who have shown to be very good pass rushers opposite him. But Hayward's been phenomenal on the inside. That is where the Bengals can sometimes struggle in pass pro, in particular on the inside. So we'll see if they can really make, you want to, as best you can, make Burrow play a little faster. Now, he's usually so poised and calm, but there is a cumulative effect to pressure, even with the great ones. Just if it's constantly there, they start to play a little faster. That's the way it works. So you ideally want to do that. On the back end, if Burrow has time and is comfortable, I think that Porter's a really good corner, size, movement, but I think they're able to make plays on the back end if Burrow is comfortable in the pocket. And I forget how many yards they put up in that game in the 44-38 game, but they didn't stop him a whole lot.
Yeah. To quickly turn that on its head, what are you seeing from Pittsburgh's offense right now?
Yeah, they're struggling. I mean, the thing is Russell Wilson, even when he was with Seattle and they, won a Super Bowl and got to another, and they had the Legion of Boom, he's not truly a timing rhythm player. Um, he's a guy that can still make plays on the move. Obviously, throws a very good deep ball. We've seen him continue to do that this year with Pittsburgh, but there's not a lot of timing and rhythm to their pass game, and they need their run game to be a factor. And again, just from what the tape shows, Warren gives them so much more juice than Najee Harris. I think that they have to play Warren, and he has to have the higher percentage of the snaps. I'm not saying you sit Najee Harris, but Warren just gives them more juice, and they need the run game not just to be a sustaining, grinding run game, but to give them some kind of, I don't want to use the word explosive because you're not going to get 6 25-yard runs, but they need more than the 4 or 5 yard runs. They need the occasional 9, 15, 17. They need that, and Warren gives them more of that.
Speaking of teams with playoff implications on the line, the Chiefs are heading to Denver, who are trying to get into the postseason as well at this point, Greg. Bo Nix has been a fun watch in that Sean Payton offense. I know we've touched on that before and certainly talked about it last week with the way that they've been able to operate. The Chiefs, we know that they're not going to play their starters. Carson Wentz is going to start in this game. Did this make the matchup show because of that,
It
or are
did
you looking at Denver?
because the Broncos win, they're in,
Yeah.
and plus they lead the NFL in sacks. And I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of that because of the Bo Nix discussion, and deservingly so. Bo Nix has had a very, very good rookie season. But this is a team that leads the NFL in sacks with some players on defense that maybe a lot of people aren't conscious of or aware of unless you're really following the league closely. I mean, Zach Allen is as good a D tackle as there is in this league this particular season. He's been very good for a number of years. John Franklin Myers, who came over from the Jets, is a very good player. The two edge players who are young players, Cooper, who came out of Ohio State, Benito, who came out of Oklahoma, have been very, very good this year.
Benito's electric. He's one of my favorite edge rushers to watch in football
Yeah,
right
and
now.
I really, it's funny. I loved him coming out. And I took a lot of grief for that. I remember because I really liked him, and people were like, "Oh, this guy," the usual routine. And I really like their safeties too. Again, two guys who are not well known: PJ Locke and Brandon Jones. Brandon Jones was in Miami. In a Vic Fangio defense, and obviously this is not a Vic Fangio defense, but I've always liked Brandon Jones, and their safeties are really good. So their defense, I actually did a defensive piece, and again, I knew I was going to do that piece before it was officially announced that Mahomes wouldn't play, but we all kind of knew, and just Carson Wentz gets sacked a lot. It'll be interesting to see what happens in this game. They could end up with 6, 7 sacks in this game.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing all these teams. Even Miami, who I know has missed Tua here in the last couple of weeks, obviously, but they're one of the three AFC teams
And
that's
I think
still
he's
on the
out again
bubble.
this week, right? Didn't they say
I
he's
I
out?
I haven't seen that myself officially, but that I may have missed it, Greg. It's
I'm
it's
pretty
entirely
sure he's
possible.
out again.
Yeah, which it's tough sledding for them at this point in a season that's been kind of wrought with injuries in the
Yeah.
quarterback position for them. To the NFC, we'll talk about the Sunday night game because obviously that's the highlight. We get to see the Lions and the Vikings square off, two 14-win teams who have obviously met already at this point in the season. But Greg, what Detroit is able to do, even though they don't get stops on defense, I know they had two turnovers in this Niners game, but I mean, every time I looked up, it felt like the Florida receiver, the
Ricky
rookie
Pearsall.
Ricky Pearsall, just running wide open
Yeah.
through the line secondary at any given moment. And I know San Fran was without their top two running backs, so maybe that's why they decided to go with a more pass heavy approach there. The way that the Lions offense operates, it's not the first time that we've talked about. It's so highly schemed. Golf is playing at such a high level. They have such a talented collection of skill position players, and also in that previous Minnesota game, Greg, it seemed like they had answers for Brian Flores' defenses, which we've talked about. Not an easy defense to play, and certainly going to throw a lot of different looks at you.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned that because in that last game, we know that the Vikings show a lot of pressure fronts and they do blitz. I think they have the highest blitz percentage, which means five or more of any team in the league. And Goff versus their pressures in that last game was 14 for 16 for 159 yards, Buck. So, both he and the O-line is part of this as well because they've got to pick all this up. They were phenomenal in dealing with the pressures. But you're right. It can be very difficult and very confusing for an offense because it's an interesting combination of their pressure fronts because you don't know how many are coming. Sometimes they only rush three and they drop everybody out. And they force you to protect. And then they win the numbers game in coverage because let's say you keep people in to protect, maybe you only have four that you send out. Maybe you only have three you send out as receivers. And all of a sudden they've got seven in coverage. But so they do that with their fronts. But then in their coverage too, they're very good with late coverage rotation. So now you have to sort of figure out both the pressure and the coverage as you're dropping, as opposed to pre-snap. I heard Tom Brady talk about their defense. I forget whether it was this past week or a week before. And, obviously Brady, one of the smartest quarterbacks ever to play, who just seemed to win before the snap 99% of the time, just talked about, and he used the word confusing. And to hear Brady use the word confusing, that means that's the way he thought about it. And it's a confusing defense to play against, but they don't have great players. And because there's a lot of moving parts, they do give up plays and points.
So we will see how that plays out on Sunday night. It'll be a great finale for Week 18. What's been a really fun season for those at the top. Greg, I mean, this league is built for parity. We understand this, and this is not necessarily a tactical question, but it feels like there's never been a wider gulf between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah,
At least in the last, I don't know, decade of NFL football, where there's so many bottom feeder teams and
I
so many
know.
great teams at the very top.
Well, and then you have the Giants who beat the Colts this week, I mean, it's funny how that works. Um, but yeah, no, and again, next year that there'll be some team that was poor this year. We hope it's Tennessee that all of a sudden wins 10, 11 games. That's the way it always seems to work. We mentioned the Vikings. I'm not saying people thought they'd be 4-13, but nobody thought they'd be 14-2. So
Yeah.
it's funny how that works, and how you can change from one season to the next. I think there's been some interesting trends this year that I'm curious to see if they continue. We've seen the run game kind of come back a bit. There's going to be quite a few backs with 300 plus carries this year, and there were none a year ago. And there's a lot of teams who clearly the foundation of their offense starts with the run game. Now, we can sit here and say it's a quarterback league, and obviously you get in the playoffs, you need your quarterback, to be a top dog, and we know that. So I'm not suggesting that that doesn't matter, but it's interesting that a lot of teams, look at the Rams, for instance, I mean, who would have thought Kyron Williams would have 316 carries? Now he probably will
Crazy.
play this week, but let's assume he would have, he could have ended the season with 335 carries. Who would have thought that going into this season?
Yeah. Listen to me. If the Titans win 10 or 11 games next year, I'll buy your first 5 ginger ales at the combine the following year. That, that, that might be a stretch, brother, but I appreciate your optimism. Greg, always good to catch up. Good to get into a new year with you. I know our new year doesn't really reset until like March 13th or 15th, whenever the new league year starts, but even still, always grateful to get to catch
Unfortunately,
up,
Buck,
and it's been a fun regular season with you, brother.
unfortunately, my new year doesn't start till like the week or so after the draft.
But we're grateful for your hard work anyway. Know that it is absolutely appreciated, not just here, but everywhere. I'll catch up with you next week when we'll be talking about some playoff games, Greg. Thank you as always.
Thanks, Buck. Appreciate it.